In the year 1913, a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey stood in the dust and heat of southern Iraq, surrounded by the crumbling brick walls and foundation stones of ancient Babylon. The air shimmered above the ground in waves of heat. Somewhere beneath his feet lay the secrets of one of humanity's greatest ancient cities, the weight of 2,000 years pressed down upon the landscape around him. Koldewey had come to this desolate place with a singular obsession, to find the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a place that ancient writers had described as a man-made paradise suspended between earth and sky. He would spend the next 18 years here, digging through the layers of time, sifting through rubble and sand, mapping the city with meticulous precision. And yet, when Koldewey finally returned to Germany in 1930, he had to face a difficult truth. Despite his decades of dedication, despite his careful excavations and his comprehensive knowledge of Babylon's layout, he had found no conclusive evidence that the Hanging Gardens had ever existed in Babylon at all. No archaeological remains, no irrigation systems that could have sustained such a marvel, no foundations of the legendary tiered structure. The gardens that ancient writers had waxed poetic about, the gardens that had captivated the imagination of scholars and dreamers for over 2,000 years, seemed to have left almost no trace of their existence in the very place where they were supposed to have been built. This absence is strange, isn't it? When you consider that the Hanging Gardens were supposed to be one of the most impressive structures ever created by human hands, you might expect to find at least something, some evidence, some fragment, some indication that such an engineering marvel had actually stood in Babylon. And yet here was Koldewey, one of the most accomplished archaeologists of his era, forced to conclude that either the gardens had been completely destroyed beyond all recognition, or perhaps, and this was a thought that lingered like an uncomfortable shadow, perhaps they had never been in Babylon in the first place. For centuries scholars had accepted this location without much question. The Hanging Gardens belonged to Babylon. That was what ancient writers had said, wasn't it? That was what the tradition insisted upon. Babylon was the great city of King Nebuchadnezzar II, the mighty king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, who had ruled from 605 to 562 BCE. It was Nebuchadnezzar, according to the ancient accounts, who had built these miraculous gardens as a gift to his wife, Amytis of Media. She had missed the green mountains and fertile lands of her homeland, the story went, and her homesick heart was breaking in the flat, arid landscape of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar, this powerful and devoted king, had constructed for her an artificial mountain, a terraced garden that rose up from the desert floor, complete with water systems that defied logic and engineering knowledge that seemed impossibly advanced for its time. He had filled it with exotic plants and flowers and trees brought from across his empire. He had made her a piece of home in a hostile land. It's a beautiful story, poignant, moving, the kind of story that feels true because it appeals to something deep in us. The desire to create beauty, to move heaven and earth for those we love, to triumph over impossible odds. And so for generations scholars had simply accepted it as fact, pointing to Babylon as the location, and Nebuchadnezzar as the king responsible for this 7th wonder. But what if the story had been wrong all along? What if the gardens had existed but somewhere entirely different? What if they had been built not in Babylon but 300 miles to the north, in a city called Nineveh? What if they had been the creation not of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, but of his bitter rival, Sennacherib, the Assyrian king? What if the garden descriptions had been mistranslated, misattributed, and misremembered until an entirely false tradition had calcified in the historical record? This is precisely what a small but vocal group of scholars began to argue, starting in the 1990s and continuing into the present day. Their case seemed so compelling, so well documented, so logical and complete that it forced the academic world to reconsider centuries of accepted wisdom. And yet it remains controversial. It remains debated. Some scholars have embraced this new theory enthusiastically, while others have resisted it strenuously, clinging to the traditional Babylonian location. What we're looking at here is a fascinating glimpse into how history works, how mysteries persist, and how sometimes the search for truth reveals something almost more interesting than the answer itself. To understand this mystery properly, we need to begin at the beginning, not with Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib, not with modern excavations or satellite imagery, but with the ancient voices that first described the Hanging Gardens to the world. We need to listen to the people who were closest to these events, or at least who claimed to be. We need to examine what they actually said, separate fact from legend, and figure out why we should trust, or distrust, their accounts. The problem is that nobody who we know of had first-hand knowledge of the Hanging Gardens actually wrote about them. Not a single account written by someone who lived in Babylon or Assyria during the time when the gardens supposedly existed has survived to us. Instead, we have descriptions from Greek historians, people who lived thousands of miles away, centuries after the gardens were built, people who were writing about a distant, half-legendary land that they had never visited and might never see. They were working from hearsay, from rumour, from the accounts of travellers, from older texts that may or may not have been accurate. It's like if historians 2,000 years from now tried to reconstruct medieval European castles based only on descriptions given by Chinese writers who had never left Asia. You might get some details right, but you'd probably get a lot wrong. One of the earliest detailed descriptions of the Hanging Gardens comes from a writer named Strabo, who lived from around 64 BCE to 24 CE. Strabo was a Greek geographer and historian, and he had a voracious appetite for information about the world. He travelled extensively, interviewed people who had been to far-flung places, and read everything he could get his hands on. In his work called Geography, Strabo writes about many wonders of the ancient world, and he includes a description of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. According to Strabo, the gardens were located in Babylon. They were incredibly tall, they were filled with greenery and exotic vegetation, and they had been built by a Syrian king for his wife. Wait, a Syrian king? That detail is interesting because it doesn't fit with the popular tradition that attributes the gardens to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. But it's a detail that most scholars have glossed over or explained away, assuming that Strabo was simply confused or misinformed about the specifics. Another ancient writer who mentions the Hanging Gardens is Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian writing in the 1st century BCE. Diodorus also places the gardens in Babylon, also attributes them to a king trying to comfort a homesick wife, and also describes them in glowing terms as a marvel of engineering and horticulture. He emphasizes their great height, their cascading water systems, their aromatic flowers, the way they were irrigated despite being built so high up in the air. These details are so vivid and specific that they feel real, don't they? They feel like eyewitness accounts, like descriptions written by someone who had actually stood in the presence of these gardens and marvelled at them. But here's the catch. Diodorus never claimed to have seen them himself. He was writing about what he had read in older texts, what he had heard from other people, what had become accepted wisdom in the Greek world about the wonders of the ancient world. And as we'll see, the further we investigate the sources of these descriptions, the thinner and thinner they become. The trail of evidence leads back through time, branching and multiplying, until we're left with vague references, obscure sources, and a lot of uncertainty. The oldest known written description of the Hanging Gardens comes from a man named Josephus, a Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century CE and who wrote extensively about the history of the Jewish people and the ancient Near East. Josephus mentions the Hanging Gardens in his discussion of Babylon, and he seems to place them there, though his description is brief and somewhat oblique. But even Josephus was writing from a distance, compiling information from various sources, not describing something he had personally witnessed. What we're left with is a strange situation. The Hanging Gardens had somehow become so famous, so legendary, that they were included in the list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a list that appears to have been compiled by Greek writers, and that includes some structures that definitely existed, like the Great Pyramid of Giza or the Colossus of Rhodes. And yet the Hanging Gardens had become famous largely through these second-hand descriptions. These Greek accounts that were themselves drawn from sources we can't quite identify, transmitted through a chain of hearsay that grew longer with each passing generation. It's like a game of telephone played across centuries, where the original message gets warped and confused until we're not entirely sure what the original sender even tried to say. The attribution to Nebuchadnezzar became standard over time. It took on the weight of tradition. Nobody questioned it. Nebuchadnezzar was, after all, the most famous king of Babylon, the greatest military commander, the most prolific builder. If anyone in Babylon had the power, the wealth, and the vision to build something like the Hanging Gardens, it would surely be him. He had conquered Jerusalem, he had rebuilt Babylon into a magnificent city, He had created the famous Ishtar Gate with its brilliant blue-glazed bricks. Surely the Hanging Gardens had been his work as well. But in the 1990s, a scholar named Stephanie Daly began to look more carefully at the ancient sources. She was working at the University of Oxford, specialising in Mesopotamian history and archaeology, and she started to notice something odd about the way the ancient writers described the Hanging Gardens. The descriptions didn't quite fit with what we knew about Babylonian geography and hydrology. The gardens were supposed to be fed by water systems that lifted water upward against gravity, an impressive feat certainly, but something that the Babylonians could certainly accomplish with their advanced knowledge of engineering and irrigation. But was it the most impressive place in Babylon to build such a structure? Babylon sat on the Euphrates River, which provided ample water. Why would a king build an elaborate, complex water system to supply water to a garden when water was already available? In Nineveh, however, ancient Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire located hundreds of miles to the north in what is now Iraq near the city of Mosul, the situation was very different. Nineveh sat on the Tigris River, but the landscape around it was more hilly, more mountainous. If an Assyrian king wanted to build terraced gardens, if he wanted to create the impression of a mountain landscape with cascading vegetation, Nineveh's geography would be far more suitable for such a project. And as Daly dug deeper into the ancient sources, she began to find references, fragmentary references, scattered references, but references nonetheless, to gardens built by an Assyrian king named Sennacherib. Sennacherib ruled Assyria from 705 to 681 BCE, making him a contemporary of the later Babylonian kings, though not specifically of Nebuchadnezzar. Like Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib was a powerful military commander and an ambitious builder. He had greatly expanded the Assyrian Empire, and he had invested enormous resources in rebuilding his capital city of Nineveh, transforming it into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. He had constructed massive palaces, adorned them with intricate reliefs carved into stone, and had assembled a famous library, the Library of Ashurbanipal, one of the oldest organised libraries we know of from the ancient world. And in ancient clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Nineveh, actual cuneiform tablets written in the Akkadian language by scribes serving the Assyrian court, there were descriptions of gardens built by Sennacherib. These weren't vague second-hand accounts from Greek writers hundreds of years later. These were official records, likely written closer in time to the actual construction of the gardens, describing them in technical detail. They described a complex water system, an aqueduct that brought water from a distance, terraced gardens that rose up in levels, exotic plants and trees. They described the project with pride and specificity, the kind of detail that suggests actual construction, actual engineering, actual implementation. What if, Daly wondered, these Assyrian gardens were the same gardens that Greek writers had later heard about, confused with Babylon and attributed to Nebuchadnezzar? What if the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were in fact not in Babylon at all, but were the magnificent gardens of Sennacherib in Nineveh, misplaced and misattributed by ancient writers operating at a great distance from the original source? This theory, when Daly and others began publishing their work in the 1990s and 2000s, was startling to many scholars. It went against centuries of accepted tradition. It required rethinking the entire history of how the ancient Greeks had understood and recorded the wonders of their world. But it also had something that the traditional theory lacked. It had ancient documentation. It had archaeological evidence. It had a logical explanation for why the gardens had never been found in Babylon despite over a century of careful excavation. The evidence that Daly uncovered was fascinating. She examined ancient cuneiform tablets that described Sennacherib's building projects in remarkable detail. She looked at archaeological remains in Nineveh that showed evidence of water systems, aqueducts, and architectural foundations that could have supported a large garden complex. She studied the topography of the two locations, Babylon and Nineveh, and noted that Nineveh's hilly terrain would be far more suitable for the construction of cascading terraced gardens like the ones described in the ancient Greek texts. She even found evidence that the Assyrian king had been particularly proud of these gardens, referring to them in his inscriptions and having them depicted in the sculptural reliefs that adorned his palace walls. Most intriguingly, she found that some of the earliest descriptions of the gardens before they became firmly associated with Babylon had actually mentioned Assyria or had been less clear about their location. The solidification of Babylon as the location seemed to be a later development, a result of how the information had been transmitted, mistranslated, and gradually became fixed in the Greek historical tradition. Now, here's where things become truly interesting, because this theory is far from universally accepted. Many scholars remain convinced that the gardens were indeed in Babylon, that Koldewey's failure to find them simply means they were destroyed too completely to leave archaeological evidence, or that our understanding of Babylon's layout is somehow incomplete. Some critics have pointed out that Daly and other supporters of the Nineveh theory may be reading too much certainty into ambiguous ancient sources, that they may be forcing the evidence to fit their preferred conclusion. The debate continues in academic journals, at conferences, in scholarly articles. Historians argue, researchers present new evidence, interpretations shift slightly one way or the other. But what makes this mystery so compelling, what makes it so perfect for contemplation as you drift towards sleep, is that we may never arrive at absolute certainty. The Hanging Gardens may have existed in Babylon, leaving almost no trace. Or they may have existed in Nineveh, their location lost to antiquity through centuries of confused transmission of information. Or, and this is a possibility that some scholars whisper about, they may never have existed at all. They may have been entirely mythical, a story that grew and developed in the telling until it became accepted as historical fact, a creation born entirely from the imagination of ancient writers and the credulity of later scholars. What we do know is this: someone at some time in some place in the ancient Near East created something remarkable. Whether it was in Babylon or Nineveh, whether it was built by Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib, someone took on the challenge of creating a garden that defied the natural landscape, that brought verdant life to an arid region, that demonstrated human ingenuity and determination in the face of impossible odds. Someone created something so impressive that stories about it travelled hundreds of miles, crossed cultural boundaries, and survived for over 2,000 years in the written record. And perhaps that's the real wonder here. Not the gardens themselves, but the way that human memory works, the way that stories transform as they travel, the way that we try to make sense of legends from our distant past. The Hanging Gardens may be mostly fiction, but the impulse to build them, to create beauty in hostile landscapes, to leave monuments to human achievement, that impulse is very real indeed. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe to the Calm Archive and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world finding these videos at different hours, in different climates and time zones, all looking for a little calm and a story to drift off to. Anyway, back to the gardens. Now that we've established the mystery, the uncertainty at the heart of this ancient legend, let's go deeper into what those Greek sources actually said. Let's examine the specific details they gave us, the descriptions of the architecture, the irrigation systems, the plants and flowers that supposedly grew there. Because within those details lies a crucial clue that scholars have been arguing about for decades. The more closely you examine what the ancients actually wrote about the Hanging Gardens, the more you start to see inconsistencies, contradictions, variations that suggest that the original sources had significant limitations in their knowledge. Strabo, for instance, described the gardens as having arches underneath them, vaults that supported the terraced structure. The gardens rose high into the air, he said, and beneath them were hollow spaces, architectural supports that held up the incredible weight of the earth, water and plants that constituted the gardens themselves. This detail appears in other ancient sources as well, the image of a structure built on arches, like a bridge suspended in the air. It's a vivid image, and it seems technically plausible, but it's also a detail that you would expect to leave significant archaeological remains, massive stone arches, massive foundations. These don't simply disappear, and yet Koldewey found nothing resembling such a structure anywhere in Babylon. When we turn to the Nineveh theory, however, this detail takes on new meaning. Sennacherib's gardens, according to the cuneiform inscriptions, did utilize an aqueduct system and likely had terraced levels that could have appeared, from a distance or in a stylized drawing, to rise up on supports. The cuneiform descriptions mention that the gardens were built on a sloping landscape, with different levels arranged on the natural hillside. There would have been walls, yes, but perhaps not the massive stone arches that the Greek writers imagined. The Greek sources, receiving the information second-hand or third-hand, may have elaborated, may have imagined more dramatic architectural elements than actually existed. This is how misinformation propagates, isn't it? Someone hears a description of something impressive and distant. They try to imagine how it would look. They add details that seem logical, that seem necessary to create the impression described. They tell someone else, who adds their own imaginative elaborations. Eventually you have a description that is partly accurate and partly fiction, a mixture of real elements and invented details that becomes impossible to untangle. The ancient writers also described the Hanging Gardens as being extraordinarily large, vast gardens covering acres of ground with hundreds or thousands of trees and plants. Some sources suggest they were large enough that the weight of all that earth and water and vegetation would have required an enormous supporting structure, something on the scale of a large building or a fortified wall. But none of the ancient sources give us specific dimensions. None of them tell us exactly how large the gardens were, exactly how they were laid out, exactly what plants grew in them. The descriptions are enthusiastic but vague, detailed in some respects but frustratingly imprecise in others. This vagueness is itself a clue. It suggests that the ancient writers themselves were not entirely certain about the specifics. They had heard stories, they had read descriptions, but they did not have direct, reliable information. They were working from the same kind of fragmentary, unclear transmission of information that we ourselves are working from today. They were doing what historians and writers do, trying to make sense of limited evidence, trying to fill in gaps with reasonable inferences, sometimes getting it right and sometimes getting it wrong. The names of the gardens, the names attributed to the builders, the stories about the romantic motivation behind their construction, all of these details were subject to variation in the ancient sources. Not all sources agreed on every point. Some versions of the story emphasized the romantic aspect more strongly. Others focused more on the engineering marvel. Some mentioned Nebuchadnezzar, others mentioned different kings. Some placed them in Babylon, while others were more ambiguous about the location. The tradition solidified gradually, but it wasn't entirely uniform, and traces of this variation still exist in the ancient texts if you look carefully enough. What Stephanie Dalley and other scholars supporting the Nineveh theory did was to take these variations seriously. They refused to assume that the settled traditional account was necessarily correct. They looked back at the sources and said, what if we've been misinterpreting these texts? What if we've missed something important? And in doing so, they opened up a whole new way of thinking about the Hanging Gardens, a way that connected them more firmly to the archaeological record and to the documented achievements of ancient Near Eastern kings. The cuneiform tablets from Nineveh describe Sennacherib's gardens in language that is both poetic and technical. The king was clearly proud of these gardens. He mentions them in inscriptions celebrating his reign. He had his scribes document them carefully, and crucially, he had scenes from the gardens depicted in the sculptural reliefs that adorned his palace, the famous Assyrian reliefs that show scenes of royal life, military campaigns, and the king's building projects. In some of these reliefs, you can see what appears to be a garden scene, with trees arranged in an organized way, with water systems visible, with the king and his court perhaps enjoying the space. These reliefs are extremely valuable to scholars because they provide contemporary visual documentation of what the gardens may have actually looked like. You have to interpret them carefully. They're not photographs, they're artistic representations, and like all art, they reflect the aesthetic choices and conventions of their creator. But they do give us a window into how the gardens actually appeared, or at least how the Assyrians themselves thought about and portrayed them. In contrast, we have no contemporary visual representations of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. No reliefs, no paintings, no artistic depictions from the Babylonian period itself. The descriptions are entirely textual, entirely reliant on the words of later writers. This seems like a curious omission if the gardens were indeed one of the greatest achievements of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. You would think he would have had them immortalized in stone, depicted in the palace reliefs, just as Sennacherib did. These archaeological and historical details are what have convinced Dalley and a growing number of other scholars that the true location of the Hanging Gardens is likely Nineveh, not Babylon. They're what have shifted the weight of evidence, at least in the minds of these scholars, away from the traditional account and toward a new understanding of this ancient mystery. And yet, as mentioned, the theory remains controversial. Many scholars are not convinced. They point out that Sennacherib's gardens, while certainly impressive, don't match all the details in the ancient Greek descriptions. They note that Babylon was a larger, more famous, more influential city than Nineveh by the time the Greek writers were active, and thus it makes sense that a famous wonder would be associated with Babylon rather than with a less prominent Assyrian city. They argue that the absence of archaeological evidence in Babylon simply means that the gardens were destroyed more completely than we would expect, or that they were located in an area that hasn't yet been fully excavated. They say that the Nineveh theory is interesting but speculative, that it goes beyond what the evidence can truly support. This disagreement, this ongoing debate between scholars, is actually one of the most fascinating aspects of this mystery, because it shows us how history works in the real world, not as a set of established facts that are certain and unchangeable, but as an ongoing process of interpretation, reinterpretation, and debate. New evidence emerges, new theories are proposed, old certainties are questioned. The field of history is not a settled territory, but an active frontier where scholars are constantly working to understand the past more completely and more accurately. The mystery of the Hanging Gardens, then, is not just the mystery of their location or their true builder. It's also a mystery about how human memory works, about how information travels through time and across cultures, about how legends form and become accepted as fact. It's a mystery about the difference between what happened in the past and what we think happened in the past, and about how those two things are not always the same. As you listen to this, perhaps beginning to feel the weight of sleep approaching, perhaps feeling your thoughts growing slower and your focus softening, consider the strangeness of this situation. Somewhere in the ancient world, something remarkable was built, something so impressive that it inspired awe and wonder in the people who knew about it. That wonder was transmitted through stories and through texts, across the centuries. It grew and developed and changed in the telling. It became a legend. It became accepted as historical fact. And now, over 2,000 years later, we're still trying to figure out where it was, what it really looked like, who built it, and whether it even really existed at all. That sense of searching through the mists of time, of trying to reconstruct something only partially understood, of following threads of evidence that lead in different directions. That's what makes this story so captivating. The gardens themselves may be lost to us forever. Their true nature may remain uncertain. But in the process of searching for them, we learn something about ourselves, about how we construct meaning from the fragments of the past, about how we create order from chaos and understanding from obscurity. In the year 600 BC, as the sun rose over the Euphrates River, Babylon stood at the absolute pinnacle of human civilization. It was not merely a city, it was a monument to ambition itself, a sprawling metropolis where empire and architecture merged into something almost mythical. The ancient historians who wrote about it centuries later seemed almost breathless in their descriptions, as though they were recounting a place that bordered on the impossible. And perhaps, in many ways, it was. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled this vast Mesopotamian empire with the kind of confidence that comes only from absolute power. He had inherited a significant kingdom from his father, but what he built with his own hands, or rather with the hands of hundreds of thousands of workers, transformed Babylon into something that would echo through the centuries. The city was not just a capital, it was a statement. It was proof that human beings could imagine something and then make that imagination real through sheer will and organized effort. The Ishtar Gate was perhaps the most visible symbol of this ambition. Named after the Mesopotamian goddess of love and war, this gate was not a simple passage through the city walls. It was a portal of stunning, almost unbelievable beauty. The gate was covered entirely in glazed blue bricks, a brilliant, vibrant blue that would have gleamed in the Mediterranean sun like precious stone. But the blue alone would have been merely striking. What made the gate truly extraordinary was what adorned those blue bricks, reliefs of animals, rendered in gold and raised so that they seemed to emerge from the very walls themselves. These were not small decorative touches. The animals, bulls called aurochs, and dragons called mushushu, with their serpentine bodies and scaled hides, were massive, imposing, rendered in exquisite detail. Each one was positioned along the processional path that connected the gate to the heart of the city. The gold would have caught the light in ways that modern observers can barely imagine, creating an effect of almost supernatural radiance. Ancient visitors approaching Babylon for the first time would have seen that blue and gold from a considerable distance, growing larger and more magnificent as they drew near. The Processional Way itself was an engineering marvel in its own right. This was the main thoroughfare of Babylon, the route used during religious festivals when the god Marduk was carried through the city streets in elaborate ceremony. The way was lined with stone carefully measured and laid. The bricks forming its surface were fitted together so precisely that no mortar was needed, a testament to the sophistication of Babylonian construction. On either side of this processional path the walls rose up, covered entirely with that same brilliant blue glaze and adorned with reliefs of lions in alternating rows. More than 100 of these magnificent beasts lined the path, each one perfect in its proportions, each one gazing out as though standing eternal guard. To walk this processional way must have been an overwhelming sensory experience. The blue would have seemed to shimmer and shift as the sun moved across the sky. The golden animals on the Ishtar Gate would have blazed like captured fire. The lions would have appeared almost alive, their eyes seeming to follow the procession. The sound of feet on stone, thousands of feet during the great festivals, would have echoed off the walls. The air would have been heavy with incense, with the smell of sacrifice, with the weight of religious significance. This was not a place designed for everyday commerce. This was a place designed to inspire awe. Beyond the Processional Way and the Ishtar Gate lay the inner city, where the greatest architectural achievements rose toward the sky. At the heart of Babylon stood the ziggurat called Itemenanki, a name that meant the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. This was not merely a religious building, it was a statement about Babylon's relationship with the divine itself. The ziggurat rose in 7 ascending terraces, each one smaller than the one below it, creating a profile that climbed toward the heavens like a staircase for the gods themselves. The base of this ziggurat was enormous. The lowest level stretched nearly 300 feet on each side, a footprint larger than a modern football field, and from this vast base the structure rose upward, terrace upon terrace, until it reached a height that scholars estimate at somewhere between 300 and 350 feet. To stand at the base of Itemenanki and look upward would have been a dizzying experience. The structure would have seemed to touch the very sky itself. Each terrace of the ziggurat was dedicated to a different deity. The colours would have varied from level to level. Blue bricks on one level, white on another, red on another still. The effect would have been almost dreamlike, a tower that seemed to shift its appearance depending on the angle and the quality of light. At the very top of the ziggurat, at the peak of Babylon's spiritual geography, stood the inner sanctum, the most sacred space in the entire city, a room where priests would commune with the divine. The ziggurat was connected to other major structures through a complex of courts and passageways. Nearby stood the Temple of Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon, where elaborate rituals and ceremonies would have taken place. The entire area would have thrummed with activity during religious festivals. Priests performing ceremonies, musicians playing, crowds of worshippers gathering in the courtyards. The air would have been thick with smoke from incense and sacrifice. The sound of chanting and music would have echoed off the surrounding buildings. Surrounding all of this grandeur were the famous walls of Babylon. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, had written about these walls with a sense of wonder that echoes even today. He described them as being so thick that a chariot drawn by 4 horses could race across the top of them side by side. While modern scholars debate the exact accuracy of Herodotus's measurements, some of his figures are clearly exaggerated, the walls were undoubtedly massive. They were built from mud brick, which might sound less impressive than stone, but in the hands of Babylonian engineers, mud brick was transformed into something formidable. The walls were constructed using a technique that had been refined over centuries of Mesopotamian building. The mud bricks were made from clay mixed with straw, pressed into wooden moulds, and then dried in the sun. Thousands upon thousands of these bricks were then laid in overlapping patterns and bound together with bitumen, a naturally occurring tar-like substance that acted as mortar. The walls rose to heights that were intimidating. Estimates vary, but they were likely somewhere between 60 and 80 feet tall. The sheer mass of brick and bitumen was so enormous that even if the walls were not quite as wide as Herodotus claimed, they would have still presented an absolutely formidable barrier against any potential invader. Beyond the walls lay the suburbs and outlying areas of the metropolitan region. Babylon was not just a walled city of monumental structures, it was a living, breathing city of hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps even approaching 1 million when you included the surrounding regions. There were residential areas where ordinary people lived, where merchants kept shops, where craftspeople practiced their trades. There were warehouses where goods from across the known world, Spices from India, tin from Anatolia, lumber from the Mediterranean were stored and traded. The Euphrates River itself was the lifeblood of the city, providing water for both the population and agriculture, serving as a highway for commerce and communication. This was the world in which Nebuchadnezzar II had chosen to create something extraordinary, the Hanging Gardens. According to the ancient sources, these gardens were not built for the glory of the empire or for the worship of the gods. They were built for love. They were built for a woman named Amytis. Amytis was the wife of Nebuchadnezzar II, and according to the historical accounts that have survived, she was from Media, a region far to the east in what is now northwestern Iran. Media was a land of mountains and green valleys, of rolling hills covered in vegetation, of streams running through lush forests. It was a land of natural beauty and abundance. Amytis had been born and raised in this landscape of verdant hills and perpetual spring. When Amytis came to Babylon as the wife of the king, she found herself in a very different world. Babylon was flat. The land around it stretched out endlessly in all directions, a vast, arid plain. The only vertical relief came from the monumental architecture of the city itself, the towers and walls and ziggurats that rose from the flat earth. The Euphrates River provided water and some scattered vegetation along its banks, but beyond that the landscape was dominated by dusty plains and the unrelenting heat of the Mesopotamian sun. Amytis is said to have suffered from homesickness. The ancient sources describe her longing for the mountains and green hills of her homeland, her sadness at finding herself in this flat, dry place so far from the landscape she loved. Some accounts describe her as almost ill with nostalgia, moving through the palace in a state of melancholy, unable to find happiness in her new life despite being a queen, despite having all the luxuries and power that a royal position could provide. It was this longing, this persistent deep homesickness, that supposedly moved Nebuchadnezzar II to action. He could not bring the mountains to his wife, he could not recreate Media within Babylon. But he could create something that might evoke the feeling of those green hills, something that might comfort her by surrounding her with the lush vegetation and living plants that she missed so desperately. So Nebuchadnezzar II, the most powerful man in the world, ordered his engineers and architects to build a miracle. He ordered them to create a garden, not a simple garden, but a garden elevated high above the ground, suspended in the air like a gift from the heavens themselves, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The ancient descriptions of these gardens painted them as unlike anything else in the world. They rose in a series of vaulted arches and terraces, one above the other, creating the effect of a mountainside, a reconstruction of those beloved Media hills, right there in the heart of Babylon. Water would have been pumped or carried upward from the Euphrates River to the highest terraces, and then allowed to cascade downward in fountains and channels, creating a cooling, refreshing environment where exotic plants and trees could be cultivated. The plants themselves were said to have been extraordinary. There were date palms and cypress trees, fig trees and pomegranates. There were flowers chosen for their beauty and fragrance, roses and lilies and other flowering plants that would have filled the gardens with colour and perfume. The description suggests that great care was taken to create a sense of natural abundance within these artificial structures, to make the gardens seem not like human constructions, but like nature itself, preserved and elevated and made perfect. The irrigation system required to maintain such gardens in the arid climate of Babylon would have been an engineering challenge of staggering proportions. Water had to be lifted from the river, possibly through the use of an ancient pump called the Archimedean screw, though that particular device may not have been invented until later, and transported upward through a series of conduits and channels to the highest terraces. From there, it would cascade downward through fountains and irrigation channels, watering the plants at each level as it descended. This constant circulation would have created a perpetual sound of flowing water, a sensory reminder of the freshness and life that characterized the homeland Amytis missed so much. The gardens were said to cover an area of approximately 75 meters on each side, a substantial footprint though not enormous. But what made them remarkable was not their size but their scale in the vertical dimension. They rose dramatically above the surrounding landscape, visible from great distances, a green oasis suspended in air above the dusty plains of Babylon. The story of the Hanging Gardens as a love gift, as a monument to one man's desire to comfort his homesick wife, has captured the imagination of people for more than 2,000 years. There is something deeply romantic about it, something that speaks to fundamental human longings. The most powerful man in the world, moved by love for a woman, commands his architects to create a wonder of the world. He takes the landscape of her homeland and reconstructs it, elevates it, perfects it. He gives her not just a garden, but a piece of home, suspended between earth and sky. But there is a problem with this beautiful story, a problem that would not become fully apparent until the age of modern archaeology, when scientists began to excavate the actual remains of ancient Babylon and compare what they found with what the ancient texts described. Robert Koldewey was a German archaeologist who had become fascinated by Babylon. In 1899, he arrived in the region of Mesopotamia with a team of researchers, and he began a systematic excavation of the site where ancient Babylon was believed to have stood. His work would continue for more than 15 years until 1917. During this time, Koldewey and his team would unearth an extraordinary amount of material. The remains of walls and buildings, thousands of artifacts, fragments that could be pieced together to understand what ancient Babylon actually looked like. Koldewey's excavations were successful in confirming many aspects of what the ancient sources had described. He found the Ishtar Gate, with its glazed blue bricks and its reliefs of lions and dragons. He found the Processional Way, with its stone foundation and its orderly layout. He found evidence of the palace complex where the king would have resided. He found the foundations of the ziggurat Etemenanki. He found the walls, or at least the architectural remains that indicated where they had stood. What he did not find was the hanging gardens. The excavations were extensive and thorough. Koldewey's team carefully examined every area of the ancient city, looking for any evidence that might correspond to the descriptions of the famous gardens. They looked for the massive irrigation infrastructure that would have been necessary to support such a system. They looked for the terraced foundations that would have been needed to support the elevated gardens. They looked for any archaeological evidence of the horticultural structures that the ancient sources described. They found nothing. There were no traces of the complex irrigation system. There were no remains of the massive pumps or devices that would have been necessary to lift water hundreds of feet into the air. There were no foundations for the terraced structures. There were no artifacts that might have belonged to the gardens. The entire site of Babylon was thoroughly excavated, and nowhere in all those ruins was there any physical evidence that the hanging gardens had ever existed. This absence of evidence became, for many scholars, evidence of absence. If the hanging gardens had truly been constructed on the scale described in the ancient sources, with their complex infrastructure and their need for constant maintenance, they should have left unmistakable archaeological traces. The fact that no such traces existed raised serious questions about whether the gardens had existed at all. This realization created a kind of historical paradox. The hanging gardens of Babylon were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, perhaps the most famous of them. They had been described in considerable detail by multiple ancient sources. The story of their creation was known and repeated throughout the ancient world. Yet no one had ever actually seen them. No archaeological evidence confirmed their existence. They existed in the historical record, but nowhere in the ground of Babylon itself. Scholars began to ask uncomfortable questions. Had the hanging gardens ever truly existed? Were they a myth, a legend that had been repeated so often that people had accepted them as fact? Were they perhaps an invention of poets and storytellers, a romantic fantasy that had become entangled with history? Or was there something else going on, some explanation that would resolve this perplexing mystery? The absence of the hanging gardens from the archaeological record became one of history's great unsolved puzzles, and it would not be until many centuries later, when scholars began to examine other ancient cities and other ancient texts, that a possible answer would begin to emerge. It would be an answer that would take the gardens far from Babylon, that would relocate them to a completely different place, and that would overturn centuries of accepted historical assumptions about one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The ancient world had no internet, no global communication networks, no way for a curious scholar in Alexandria or Rome to simply travel to Babylon and verify claims about monuments. What existed instead was a fragmented, fragile chain of written accounts, stories passed from one writer to another, sometimes directly quoted, sometimes paraphrased, sometimes transformed beyond recognition. The hanging gardens of Babylon would come to us through this exact mechanism. a series of voices across centuries, each adding detail, interpretation, and inevitably uncertainty. And as we trace these voices backward through time, we begin to understand that the gardens may have been less witnessed than imagined, less documented than dreamed. The earliest known written reference to the Hanging Gardens comes from Berossus, a Babylonian priest who lived around 290 BC, during the Hellenistic period when Greek culture had swept across the Near East following Alexander the Great's conquests. Berossus occupied a unique position in history. He was a bridge between two worlds, a scholar trained in Babylonian tradition, but writing for a Greek-speaking audience. He composed a 3-volume history of Babylon called the Babylonica, written in Greek, and in this work he attributed the construction of the Hanging Gardens to Nebuchadnezzar II, the great Babylonian king who had ruled nearly 3 centuries before Berossus was born. Nebuchadnezzar, according to Berossus's account, built the gardens as a gift to his homesick wife, a Median princess who longed for the green hills and mountains of her homeland. It is a touching story, almost romantic in its sensibility. A powerful king summoning engineers and architects to create an artificial landscape. Terraces of stone and soil rising like a mountain from the flat Mesopotamian plain, filled with exotic plants and watered by ingenious hydraulic systems. Yet here lies the first major problem with our knowledge of the Hanging Gardens. Berossus's original writings have not survived. We do not possess the Babyloniaca in its complete form. What we have instead are fragments, quotations and paraphrases preserved by later Greek and Roman authors who read Berossus centuries after his death. It is like trying to understand a conversation by listening only to the parts that someone else chose to repeat. We hear Berossus's voice only through other voices, filtered through other minds, selected by other hands. The original text is ghost-like, present only through its echoes. When we read what Berossus supposedly wrote about the Hanging Gardens, we are reading what a later author believed Berossus to have written, and that is a crucially different thing. One of the most important sources we have, and thus one of the most important voices channeling Berossus, is Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian who lived around 60 BC. By this time, nearly 2 centuries had passed since Berossus wrote, and another 2.5 centuries had passed since Nebuchadnezzar actually reigned. Diodorus compiled a massive universal history called the Bibliotheca Historica, covering the known world from mythological times down to his own era. In this sprawling work he described the Hanging Gardens in considerable detail, and his account is among the most vivid we possess. According to Diodorus, the gardens were constructed on arches and vaults, creating passages underneath where chariots could drive. The terraces rose to a height of about 80 feet, held up by cube-shaped columns that were as thick as stone pillars. The soil, he tells us, was deep enough to sustain trees of considerable size, and the entire structure was irrigated by a screw or pipe system that raised water from the Euphrates River below. He describes the accumulated earth as so rich and deep that great trees were able to thrive there, their roots stretching downward through soil rather than mere plaster or shallow substrate. The descriptions from Diodorus are remarkably specific. He gives us measurements, 80 feet tall, 400 feet across. He specifies the materials, stone, brick, earth. He names the mechanisms, screw pumps and hydraulic systems, and yet the more specific a description, the more we might wonder, how did Diodorus know these things? He was writing in the 1st century BC, centuries after the gardens were supposed to have been built and centuries after they supposedly ceased to exist. We have no record of Diodorus visiting Babylon. We have no evidence that he interviewed anyone who had seen the gardens. How then did he arrive at such detailed specifications? The most straightforward answer, and the one that most scholars now embrace, is that he was repeating, interpreting, and perhaps embellishing information he found in written sources, likely including Berossus. He was creating a convincing narrative from fragments, much as any historian might do, but unlike a modern historian with photographs and archaeological records, he was working with precious little to anchor his descriptions to material reality. Strabo, the Greek geographer who lived from approximately 64 BC to 24 AD, offers another crucial account. Strabo is perhaps best known for his Geographica, a 17-volume work describing the lands and peoples of the Mediterranean world and beyond. Strabo was a prolific writer, well-travelled for his time, and deeply engaged with the question of how to understand distant places and verify accounts. And yet, like Diodorus before him, Strabo never visited Babylon. His description of the Hanging Gardens focuses particularly on the mechanical aspects, the water lifting systems, the pumps that raised water from the river below up to the upper terraces. Strabo describes what sounds like an Archimedean screw, the spiral pump later famously attributed to Archimedes, a device that uses rotating helical surfaces to lift water. The precision of his mechanical description is striking. He writes of the engineering required to move water upward against gravity, of the necessary power and calculation. Again, we must ask, how did he know? The answer remains uncertain, but the most likely explanation is that he too was drawing from earlier sources, synthesizing what earlier writers had reported. What becomes apparent when we examine these three major sources, Brossus, Diodorus and Strabo, is a pattern. Each writer, separated from the gardens by centuries, provides descriptions that feel authoritative and detailed, yet none of them claims to have seen the gardens directly. None of them mentions visiting Babylon or speaking with eyewitnesses. Instead, each seems to be drawing from a well of accumulated tradition, a kind of collective memory inscribed in texts. The problem is that without any primary eyewitness accounts surviving, without any contemporary records from Babylon itself, we cannot verify whether this accumulated tradition describes something real or something elaborated through retelling. It is entirely possible that the gardens were exactly as described. It is also entirely possible that what began as a vague rumour or a description of a smaller feature became increasingly detailed and grandiose as it passed through the hands of successive writers, each adding plausibility through specificity. Other voices in the ancient world also mentioned the Hanging Gardens, though often in passing. Philo of Byzantium, a Greek writer and mathematician whose dates are uncertain, but who likely lived sometime around the 2nd century BC, included the Hanging Gardens in his list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This inclusion was significant, as it embedded the gardens in a canonical set of monuments that represented the pinnacle of ancient architectural achievement. The 7 wonders concept itself is fascinating. It was essentially a kind of ancient tourist guide, a catalogue of sites that the educated Greek or Roman traveller should aspire to see. The list varied somewhat depending on who was compiling it, but typically included the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Statue of Zeus at Olympia, and various candidates for the 7th wonder. The Hanging Gardens often took one of the final slots in these lists. By including the gardens in this prestigious catalogue, ancient writers gave them a status and legitimacy that may have exceeded what their documentation actually warranted. The gardens became not merely an interesting historical feature, but one of the defining achievements of the ancient world. They were grouped alongside structures that were actually visible, actually accessible, actually verifiable by anyone with the means to travel. The Great Pyramid still stood, and still stands. The ruins of other wonders were visible in antiquity. But the Hanging Gardens were different. They were a member of the club whose membership itself could not be proven. They were the phantom wonder, the doubtful triumph, the magnificent achievement that no traveller from the classical world left a clear record of having actually seen. Consider the nature of ancient documentation for a moment. We have no contemporary accounts from Babylon describing the construction of the gardens under Nebuchadnezzar. We have no Babylonian king lists that specifically mention this project. We have no architectural remains in Babylon that clearly correspond to the descriptions left by Greek writers. What we have instead are these secondary accounts, written in Greek, composed centuries after the supposed construction, repeating traditions whose original sources are now lost. It is a curious thing, for a monument that supposedly was one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world, to be so poorly documented in the land where it supposedly stood. Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century AD, also engaged with the question of the Hanging Gardens, though again, he was centuries removed from the time they were supposedly built. Josephus had access to older sources, and he quoted accounts that he believed derived from Brossus. In his work, he described the gardens and attempted to place them within the broader narrative of Babylonian history under Nebuchadnezzar. Josephus was a serious scholar, careful in his methods, yet he too was ultimately working with secondary sources, inheriting descriptions that had already travelled through many hands and many centuries. The problem of the sources becomes even more acute when we consider what scholars call the question of original observation. Among all the detailed descriptions of the hanging gardens that survive from antiquity, not one comes from someone who explicitly claims to have witnessed them. Not one ancient writer says, "I saw this with my own eyes," or "I travelled to Babylon and observed the gardens." The descriptions are all reported observations, second-hand or further removed. It is as though the gardens existed in a realm between documented fact and legendary narrative, real enough to mention, plausible enough to describe in detail, yet elusive enough to never quite be pinned down by a credible eyewitness account that survived to us. Some scholars have proposed that perhaps the Greek and Roman writers were confusing different structures, different times, different places. Perhaps what Nebuchadnezzar actually built was something else, a palace garden, or a terrace garden of impressive but not miraculous proportions, and later writers, impressed by descriptions, began to elaborate it into something more fantastical. Perhaps the hanging gardens that captured the imagination of Greek writers were an exaggerated version of a real but more modest feature, or perhaps, some scholars suggest, the gardens never existed in Babylon at all, and the entire tradition arose from confusion with gardens or architectural features in other locations. The distance between these ancient writers and the gardens they described is not merely temporal but epistemological, not merely a matter of how much time had passed, but of how the knowledge of the gardens had to travel to reach them. It had to travel through the transformation of language, from Babylonian cuneiform records, if any existed, to Aramaic or Persian accounts, then to Greek. It had to travel through the interpretations of successive writers, each of whom may have added emphasis or detail. It had to survive the loss of original texts, remaining only in quotations embedded in other authors' works. And through all of this travelling, this translating, this quoting and paraphrasing, the gardens remained vivid, detailed, convincing, and yet fundamentally unverified. Take a moment now to imagine what this must have felt like from the perspective of an ancient Greek scholar. You live in Alexandria or in a Greek city, perhaps in the century after Berossus wrote. You read his account of magnificent gardens in distant Babylon. The description is specific. The heights, the materials, the engineering. It comes from a source with authority, a Babylonian priest who might have had access to the knowledge of his own people. Other writers have repeated and elaborated on these descriptions. The gardens have become famous, canonical, part of the list of wonders that define human achievement. And yet you have never seen them yourself. Few people you know have seen them, but the authority of the written word, the consistency of multiple sources agreeing on basic facts, the plausibility of the description, all of this creates a compelling sense of reality. The gardens feel real because they are described in such convincing detail, because reputable sources mention them, because they fit into the known world and the known achievements of kings. This is the psychology of ancient documentation. Without photographs, without film, without the ability to instantly verify information, authority and consistency become the markers of truth. A thing that is written about in detail, in multiple sources by educated men, such a thing has the weight of truth behind it, even if no one living has actually seen it. And perhaps that is how the hanging gardens achieved their place in the imagination of the ancient world. They were real because they were described as real. They were famous because educated people wrote about them. They were among the wonders because scholars placed them in that category. Reality and legend became almost indistinguishable, woven together in a narrative so convincing that it has lasted 2,000 years. Now, settle into stillness for a moment. Imagine the cool stone of a Babylonian palace, the weight of silence in an ancient courtyard. Imagine the texture of clay tablets beneath your fingers, cuneiform marks catching the light of an oil lamp. Imagine sitting in a library in Alexandria, papyrus scrolls stacked around you, your eyes moving across Greek letters describing places you will never see, monuments you will never visit. The gardens exist in this space, in your imagination, in the written word, in the authority of accumulated tradition. You do not need to have seen them to feel their reality. The description is enough. The detail is enough. The fact that others believe in them is enough. And perhaps that is the most important insight we can draw from these ancient sources, that the hanging gardens achieved immortality not because they were definitively documented or proven to exist, but because they were described in such compelling terms that generation after generation of readers chose to believe in them. What is remarkable about the hanging gardens when we examine them through the lens of these ancient sources is that they are unique among the seven wonders in a crucial way. The other wonders, the Great Pyramid, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, these were documented in their own time, mentioned in the records and writings of the societies that built them. Inscriptions, contemporary accounts, administrative records, all of these helped establish their existence beyond doubt. But the Hanging Gardens stand alone. They are the only wonder of the ancient world whose existence is not conclusively supported by evidence contemporary to their supposed construction. They are the only wonder for which we must rely almost entirely on accounts written centuries after the fact, by people with no first-hand knowledge, based on sources now lost to us. This is not necessarily to say they did not exist. It is simply to acknowledge that the method by which we know about them is fundamentally different from the method by which we know about the other wonders. They exist in the ancient world primarily as a written phenomenon, as an idea that passed from mind to mind through the medium of text, rather than as a physical structure that left unambiguous traces in the archaeological record. The chain of sources then stretches backward from us through these ancient writers, from Josephus to Strabo, to Diodorus to Berossus to sources now lost. Each link in the chain represents a potential point where details could shift, where emphasis could change, where a vivid description could become even more vivid in the retelling, and yet, remarkably, the basic story remains consistent. Nebuchadnezzar built them for his wife. They were terraced gardens rising to great heights. They contained full-size trees. They required elaborate hydraulic systems to maintain irrigation. This consistency across centuries and across different sources is impressive. It suggests that the writers were not inventing the gardens from whole cloth, but rather were drawing on some underlying tradition or account. But consistency in a chain of transmission is not the same as verification in the real world. A story can be consistent and still be legendary. A detail can be repeated across multiple sources and still be unverified. The fact that many ancient writers believed in the gardens, wrote about them seriously, and included them in canonical lists of wonders, this tells us that the ancient world believed in them. It does not necessarily tell us they were real. And so we arrive at one of the most fascinating paradoxes in the study of the ancient world. The Hanging Gardens are famous precisely because they are documented in ancient sources, yet they are doubtful precisely because they are only documented in ancient sources, with no contemporary evidence, no archaeological confirmation, no contemporary Babylonian records to support the Greek descriptions. They achieved immortality through the written word, but they also achieved obscurity through the very limitation of that documentation. They are real in the realm of ideas, real in the history of how ancient peoples imagined their own achievements, real in the influence they have had on later cultures and architectures, but their existence in the material world, on the ground in ancient Babylon, remains uncertain, a mystery that no Greek historian, no matter how detailed their descriptions, has been able to solve for us. The gardens live in that strange twilight between fact and legend, between documented history and beautiful myth, and they remain there still. For 2 decades, Dr. Stephanie Dalley of Oxford University pursued a theory that would fundamentally reshape our understanding of one of history's greatest mysteries. She did not begin her career intending to challenge the location of the Hanging Gardens. Rather, she found herself drawn into a careful study of ancient Assyrian cuneiform tablets, the clay records that Assyrian kings had commissioned to document their reign and accomplishments. These tablets, written in an ancient language that required years of specialized training to decipher, contained descriptions of palaces and gardens that seemed oddly familiar to anyone studying the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. As Dalley worked through translation after translation, cross-referencing Greek accounts with Assyrian records, a troubling discrepancy emerged. The descriptions in the Greek texts, the terraced gardens, the water-lifting systems, the architectural grandeur seemed to match not the accounts of Babylon during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, but rather the palace inscriptions of an earlier Assyrian king named Sennacherib, who ruled from 705 to 681 BC. The timing alone suggested something remarkable. Nebuchadnezzar did not ascend to the throne of Babylon until 605 BC, more than a century after Sennacherib's reign had ended. Classical writers like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, who described the Hanging Gardens with such vivid detail, were writing centuries after these events had occurred. The accounts had passed through multiple layers of translation and retelling. Somewhere along that long chain of transmission, Dalley suspected, the truth had become obscured. The gardens that ancient writers attributed to Babylon might have actually originated in Nineveh, the great northern capital of the Assyrian Empire located in what is now northern Iraq near the city of Mosul. To understand how such confusion might have arisen, one must consider the complex political geography of ancient Mesopotamia and the way ancient cities were named and remembered. After the Assyrian Empire conquered Babylon, the northern city of Nineveh was sometimes referred to in administrative documents as New Babylon, or similar appellations. Greek geographers, writing centuries later and relying on second-hand accounts and trade reports, might easily have confused the two cities. The distinction between Old Babylon and the Assyrian realm would have blurred in the minds of writers who had never visited either location and who were working with incomplete or contradictory source material. What seemed like a straightforward attribution to Babylon in classical texts might have originally referred to the Assyrian palace city of Nineveh. The more Daly studied the ancient sources, the more this theory seemed to explain the persistent mysteries surrounding the garden's location and construction. The key to Daly's breakthrough lay in the royal inscriptions that Sennacherib himself had left behind. These texts, carved into stone and pressed into clay, were not poetic or metaphorical. They were functional documents, records meant to establish the king's accomplishments for posterity and for the gods. Sennacherib was a prolific builder and an ambitious ruler who expanded Assyrian power across the Near East. He made Nineveh the greatest city of his empire, transforming it into a showcase of Assyrian might and sophistication. In his inscriptions, preserved across multiple sources and carefully studied by scholars like Daly, Sennacherib described his palaces and gardens in specific, detailed terms. He spoke of a palace without rival, a structure that surpassed all others in grandeur and ingenuity. He described elaborate gardens adorned with trees brought from distant lands, water features that seemed to defy nature itself, and terraces that rose in impossible layers above the city. What made these descriptions extraordinary was their correspondence with the Greek accounts of the Hanging Gardens. When Strabo described the gardens as having trees planted on brick and stone columns, Sennacherib's inscriptions spoke of precisely such arrangements. When classical writers mention an elaborate system for lifting water to the upper levels of the gardens, Sennacherib's texts referenced his engineering prowess and his ability to make water flow where it naturally would not. The level of detail and the specific technological achievements mentioned in both sources seemed too closely aligned to be coincidence. Daly began to see a pattern emerging from the cuneiform tablets, a description of a palace and its grounds that could have inspired the Greek accounts of the Hanging Gardens. The engineering challenge that Sennacherib faced in Nineveh was formidable. The city sat in northern Mesopotamia, where the climate was drier than the regions to the south, and securing a reliable water supply for gardens was far more difficult than in areas closer to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Sennacherib, determined to create something unprecedented, commissioned one of the greatest engineering projects of the ancient world, an aqueduct system that stretched for more than 50 miles, bringing water from the mountains of the north down to Nineveh. This was not a simple canal or channel. The aqueduct was an enormously complex feat of hydraulic engineering, designed to overcome differences in elevation, to cross valleys and rough terrain, and to maintain a consistent flow of water across vast distances. The technology required to accomplish this was cutting edge for its time, representing the accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamian engineers who had worked to solve such problems for centuries. The Jerwan aqueduct, located in the region around Nineveh, stands as physical evidence of this ambitious project. Constructed from massive stone blocks fitted together with remarkable precision, the aqueduct stretches across a valley, supporting the water channel that flowed across its top. The structure itself is approximately 280 meters long, though the overall aqueduct system extended much farther. Built specifically to serve Sennacherib's palace and its gardens, the Jerwan aqueduct represents one of the oldest known aqueducts in the entire world. Its design and scale would have been known to those who travelled through Nineveh during Sennacherib's reign and for centuries afterward. The engineering sophistication on display in the Jerwan aqueduct matches precisely the kind of water lifting and water management technology that Strabo had described in his accounts of the Hanging Gardens. If someone were to describe the Greek accounts without knowing about Sennacherib's aqueducts, one might have assumed they were purely fantastical. But the aqueduct exists. It can be seen, studied, measured, and understood. It proves that such technology was not merely the fancy of later writers, but a real accomplishment of ancient engineering. Dali's research led her to examine not only the technical descriptions in Sennacherib's inscriptions, but also the artistic representations that Assyrian craftsmen had created. Stone reliefs decorated Sennacherib's palace walls, serving both as decoration and as a form of propaganda, celebrating the king's accomplishments and the magnificence of his reign. Among these reliefs were carvings that depicted gardens. In these artistic renderings, one can see clearly the arrangement that the hanging gardens must have possessed. The reliefs show trees planted on multiple levels, set against architectural backdrops that suggest carefully constructed terraces. Water channels appear in these carvings, flowing from upper levels down through the gardens. The depiction shows not a flat ground-level garden, but rather a structure of considerable height and complexity, with water distributed throughout the different levels. The Assyrian sculptors who created these reliefs had been present in Nineveh, had seen these gardens with their own eyes, and had rendered them as accurately as their artistic skill allowed. What they produced was essentially a blueprint, a visual record of what the hanging gardens of Sennacherib actually looked like. The location itself presented an additional layer of interest to Dali's theory. Nineveh, in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, occupied a position that made it a hub of commerce and cultural exchange. Merchants, travellers, and diplomats passed through the city regularly, visiting the palace and observing its wonders. Greek traders had access to this region, and would have been among those who witnessed Sennacherib's gardens. When these travellers returned to Greece, and subsequently described what they had seen to others, their accounts would have been based on direct experience, on memory, and on the natural human tendency to embellish and refine stories with each retelling. As the story passed from one Greek writer to another, as it was preserved in texts that were themselves copied and recopied over centuries, the attribution to Babylon might have become increasingly established, particularly after Babylon's political resurgence under later rulers like Nebuchadnezzar. The legendary status of Babylon as one of the great cities of antiquity might have made later writers assume that such a wonder must have belonged to Babylon rather than to the Assyrian realm, which was less familiar to Greek audiences of later periods. Dali's examination of the ancient sources revealed something else of considerable importance: the presence of water-lifting devices that are specifically described in classical accounts. Strabo mentions screws and other mechanical devices used to raise water from lower levels to higher levels, allowing the gardens to be irrigated despite their elevation above the surrounding ground. Such devices are not hypothetical or speculative. The Archimedean screw, named after the Greek mathematician Archimedes, is one such device, though Archimedes was a much later figure. The principle of using a screw mechanism to raise water was known and practiced in the ancient Near East long before Archimedes formalized the mathematical principles behind it. Mesopotamian engineers, working under Sennacherib's direction, would have been familiar with mechanical means of raising water. The existence of the Joan aqueduct and the complex water system that Sennacherib built demonstrates that such engineering knowledge was actively applied in Nineveh. The descriptions in the classical texts of water-lifting devices, therefore, do not represent impossible fantasy, but rather a memory of actual technology that was being used in Sennacherib's gardens. The inscriptions that Sennacherib left behind go into considerable detail about the plants that adorned his palace gardens. He speaks of trees brought from distant lands, species that would not naturally grow in the climate of northern Mesopotamia. These included cedars and other prized timber trees, as well as fruit trees and ornamental species. The idea of collecting exotic plants and maintaining them in elaborate gardens was not unique to Sennacherib, but the scale and systematic nature of his effort was remarkable. The royal gardens served multiple purposes. They were displays of the king's power and his ability to command resources. They were places of physical comfort and aesthetic beauty, and they held symbolic meaning, representing the king's dominion over nature itself and his divine right to rule. Maintaining gardens filled with exotic plants in a climate where they did not naturally flourish was a way of demonstrating control over the natural world, a kind of horticultural statement of royal supremacy. If you're still awake and enjoying this exploration of Nineveh and Sennacherib, consider subscribing to the Calm Archive. A like really does help more people find these videos when they can't sleep. Now, let's get back to Nineveh and the final evidence that scholars have uncovered in their study of this remarkable city. The archaeological excavations that have been conducted at Nineveh over the past century and a half have yielded artifacts and structures that corroborate Dali's theory in compelling ways. The remains of Sennacherib's palace have been excavated and studied extensively. The layout of the palace complex reveals a sophisticated understanding of spatial planning and architectural design. Gardens would have been integral to such a palace, not as an afterthought, but as a central element of the overall design. The palace was not simply a place of government and residence. It was a showcase, a place where the king could display the full extent of his power, his wealth, and his refined taste. The inclusion of elaborate gardens would have been essential to this purpose. The surviving records and artistic depictions from Nineveh provide clear evidence that gardens of considerable sophistication existed within and around the palace complex. The question of water supply was fundamental to the entire project. Daly's research into the ancient sources and the archaeological evidence revealed that Sennacherib had solved this problem with extraordinary ingenuity. The Joan Aqueduct was not the only water management project that Sennacherib undertook. Multiple aqueducts and canals were constructed to bring water from distant sources down to Nineveh. This extensive infrastructure represented an enormous investment of resources and labour, but it was justified by the king's desire to create gardens that would demonstrate his power and vision. The water, once it reached Nineveh, would have been distributed throughout the palace gardens using a system of channels and possibly mechanical lifting devices. The remains of these channels can still be traced in the archaeological record, providing tangible evidence of the sophistication of the water management system. Daly's theory also explains a geographic puzzle that had troubled earlier scholars. Babylon is located in central Mesopotamia, in a relatively flat region with good access to water through the Euphrates River. There would have been no compelling reason for Nebuchadnezzar to engage in the elaborate, expensive hydraulic engineering that the Hanging Gardens required. The engineering challenges would have been minimal. Nineveh, by contrast, sat in a region where water was harder to secure and the terrain more challenging. This geographic reality made Nineveh a place where such ambitious engineering would have been necessary, and where it would have been far more impressive. The fact that Sennacherib undertook such projects aligns perfectly with the classical descriptions of gardens that required extraordinary engineering to exist. Nebuchadnezzar, in his Babylonian setting, would have had no reason to undertake such massive hydraulic projects simply to create gardens when simpler methods would have sufficed. Sennacherib, in his challenging northern climate and on his elevated palace site, would have faced exactly the engineering problems that the Hanging Gardens were reputed to present. The artistic and written records that survive from Nineveh provide a window into the aesthetic and cultural values of the Assyrian Empire. Sennacherib, like other great rulers of the ancient world, sought to create monuments to his own greatness. He invested heavily in architecture, sculpture, libraries, and other cultural projects. The royal gardens were one more expression of his vision for Nineveh as a centre of civilization and power. The gardens would have represented not merely a practical space for growing food, but a carefully curated environment meant to impress visitors and to serve as a retreat for the king and his court. The terraced arrangement, the exotic plants, the elaborate water systems, and the artistic decoration of the gardens would have created an environment of unparalleled beauty and sophistication. To anyone who had experienced such gardens, the memory would have been vivid and powerful, exactly the kind of memory that would survive in the form of legendary accounts passed down through generations. Daly's work in recent years has focused on bringing this theory to the attention of scholars and the broader public, presenting the evidence in clear, systematic form. She has published scholarly articles detailing her research, she has given presentations at academic conferences, and she has engaged with media outlets to discuss her findings. The response from the academic community has been mixed, with some scholars embracing her theory as the most plausible explanation yet offered for the location of the Hanging Gardens, while others have argued for continued skepticism or have presented counter-arguments. This scholarly debate is exactly how the process of historical investigation should work. Theories are proposed, evidence is examined, alternative explanations are considered, and gradually a consensus emerges, or new evidence tips the scales toward one interpretation or another. Daly's theory has not been universally accepted, but it has become one of the major contenders in the ongoing scholarly discussion of the Hanging Gardens' true location. The implications of accepting Daly's theory extend beyond the simple matter of whether the Hanging Gardens stood in Babylon or Nineveh. If the gardens were indeed built by Sennacherib in Nineveh, then our understanding of Assyrian civilization, of Sennacherib's reign, and of the cultural transmission from the ancient Near East to the classical Greek world must be reconsidered. The gardens would represent a remarkable achievement of Assyrian engineering and aesthetics, a demonstration of the power of the Assyrian state at the height of its influence. They would also illustrate the process by which wonders of the ancient world became legendary, how the memory of real places and achievements becomes transformed and relocated through the mechanisms of cultural transmission and the inevitable distortions of time. The Hanging Gardens would cease to be a mystery and become instead a known achievement of a known ruler in a known location, documented in contemporary records and preserved in archaeological evidence. The loss of mystery would be compensated by the gain of certainty and understanding. The ancient engineers who designed these gardens, whether in Babylon or Nineveh, faced a problem that seems almost impossible when you consider the constraints of their time. Picture the Mesopotamian landscape, flat, arid, with a river running through it at a level far below where gardens would need to be. The Euphrates at Babylon, the Tigris near Nineveh, both flowed at ground level, yet the gardens, according to every ancient account, rose up in terraces of magnificent height. Water does not flow upward. It does not defy gravity. Yet somehow, thousands of years before modern irrigation systems existed, these gardeners moved water from the river to the highest reaches of their creation. This is where engineering and art merged into something that seemed, to the ancients who witnessed it, almost like magic. The most basic challenge was simple in concept but staggering in execution: lift water. Modern solutions involve pumps powered by electricity. Ancient engineers had only human muscle, animal power, and the leverage that comes from understanding physics at a fundamental level. The technologies they developed were elegant in their simplicity, and some remain in use in parts of the world today. One of the oldest methods for lifting water, documented in Egyptian murals dating back over 3,000 years, was the shaduf. Imagine a long wooden pole balanced on a fulcrum like a seesaw. At one end hangs a bucket or container. At the other end, a heavy counterweight, sometimes stone, sometimes filled with clay. A worker pulls down on the bucket end, dips it into the water below, and then releases. The counterweight pulls the bucket back up. It is rhythmic, almost meditative. One person can lift water perhaps 10 or 15 feet with a single shaduf. Two shadufs stacked would lift it 20 or 30 feet. Arranged in a series, one above another, each lifting water from the basin created by the one below, water could climb substantial heights. In Egyptian tomb paintings, you see lines of workers, each manning one shaduf, passing water upward like a human relay. The sound of it, the creak of wood, the splash of water falling into basins, would have been constant during the gardening season. But the shaduf, efficient as it is, requires constant human attention. For a garden as vast as the Hanging Gardens were described to be, covering acres upon acres with tens of thousands of trees, shadufs alone could never have sufficed. The water requirement would have been enormous, especially in the heat of Mesopotamian summer. Ancient texts suggest that the gardens employed not hundreds, but thousands of workers. Some were certainly dedicated to water lifting duty, working in shifts from dawn until dusk. But there had to be mechanisms that did not require constant human labour. This is where another technology enters the picture. The Archimedean screw, or something very much like it. Archimedes, the Greek mathematician, is credited with inventing or at least formalising this device in the 3rd century before the Common Era. But the technology likely existed in some form much earlier, particularly in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The screw is elegant in its design. Imagine a spiral carved or formed inside a tube. The tube is tilted at an angle, perhaps 45 degrees. As the screw rotates, turned by a handle at the bottom, or rotated by animal power, or by workers cranking it, the spiral pushes water upward, from one end of the tube to the other. A single screw can lift water 20, 30, or even 40 feet depending on its length and pitch. Multiple screws could be chained together, each one lifting water higher until it reached the required elevation. What makes the screw so effective is that it moves a continuous stream of water. Unlike the shaduf, which works in discrete lifts, the screw creates a flow. For the volume of water needed by a massive garden, this is crucial. Scholars believe that Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, would have used screws in his irrigation system at Nineveh. The technology was known, the engineering expertise existed. Whether the Babylonian gardens used the same system, or some other method we have not yet imagined, remains a mystery. But we know water had to be moved, and these were the tools available. Beyond the screws and shadoffs, there were also chain pumps. Picture a long chain or rope, fitted with small buckets or discs at regular intervals, running over two wheels or pulleys. One pulley is placed in the water, the other at the height where water needs to arrive. As the chain rotates, turned by human workers or animals, the buckets or discs dip into the water at the bottom, carry it upward, and tip it out into a basin or channel at the top. The device is simple but ingenious. It can move a steady volume of water over considerable distances and heights. Ancient artisans understood the mechanics of pulleys and wheels. They built them from wood and stone. There were also water wheels, particularly of the undershot variety, where flowing water in a canal or channel strikes buckets attached to the wheel's outer edge, causing it to rotate. This rotation could be geared to drive a screw or other lifting mechanism, using the power of the flowing river itself rather than human muscle. No written descriptions of water wheels appear in ancient Mesopotamian texts, but the technology would have been within their capabilities. Egypt used them later. The technology spread. The Tigris or Euphrates, flowing past Nineveh or Babylon, could have powered such wheels. In Nineveh specifically, archaeological evidence has revealed the sophisticated system that Sennacherib constructed. The king was proud of his achievement and had it recorded in inscriptions. His engineers built an aqueduct system of stunning scale and complexity. Water from mountain springs in the far north, in what is now Turkey, was channeled across more than 50 miles through carefully constructed canals and elevated aqueducts. This water, cool and clean from the high elevations, flowed downward and across the landscape, following gravity but carefully guided by human engineering. The crown jewel of this system was the Jerwan Aqueduct, a structure so well engineered that parts of it still stand today. The aqueduct was built to cross a valley, carrying the water channel across a chasm that would otherwise have blocked it. To do this, Sennacherib's architects employed corbelled arches, a technique where stones are layered, each one projecting slightly further than the one below, creating a vault or arch effect without requiring a keystone or true arch. It is a style of construction that was familiar to Mesopotamian builders. The result was a high, graceful structure that spanned the valley. The channel that ran atop this aqueduct was lined with stone and sealed with waterproofing materials to prevent seepage. The waterproofing itself is a testament to ancient engineering knowledge. The Jerwan aqueduct, according to archaeological studies, was lined with layers of carefully chosen materials. First came a layer of compacted clay, which acts as a seal. Above that, a layer of reed matting was applied, woven from the reeds that grow along the riverbanks. This matting provides tensile strength and helps distribute stress across the clay. Then came the crucial layer, bitumen, a naturally occurring tar-like substance that can be found in certain regions and must be heated to be applied. Bitumen is one of the best waterproofing materials available, even by modern standards. It is flexible, durable, and resistant to water penetration. The ancients understood this. They had discovered bitumen in the region. It seeps naturally from the ground in some areas. They learned to harvest it, heat it, and apply it in layers. In some systems, there were also thin sheets of lead, hammered and fitted carefully to create an additional waterproofing barrier. Lead is extremely durable and water-resistant. The labour of producing these sheets and fitting them into place would have been immense, but for the most critical sections of the system, particularly where the most important channels were located, the expense was considered worthwhile. The combination of clay, reed matting, bitumen and lead created a barrier that could last for centuries. Indeed, sections of these ancient aqueducts have survived and retained water, even after more than 2,000 years. The engineering problem did not end once water reached the gardens. The water had to be distributed throughout the planted terraces. Channels and pipes, constructed from ceramic, stone or wood, would have been laid throughout the structure. The channels themselves were engineering marvels. They had to maintain the correct gradient to allow water to flow by gravity alone, yet distribute the water evenly across wide areas. Too steep a gradient and water would rush through in torrents, unable to be absorbed. Too shallow and water would stagnate or pool unevenly. The ancient engineers worked out these principles through trial, error, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. As water flowed through the channels, it would have cascaded onto the terraces below, falling through the air in sheets or streams that would have created the misty, humid environment described in poetic accounts. The water would have soaked into the soil of the gardens, irrigating the planted areas and excess water would have flowed downward to the next terrace below. A sophisticated drainage system would have been necessary to prevent water from accumulating at the bottom of the gardens, where it would cause waterlogging and rot the wooden supports and stone foundations. Drainage channels, slightly lower than the irrigation channels but following the same paths, would have collected excess water and directed it back to the river. The irrigation challenge, however, was only one part of the engineering puzzle. The terraces themselves had to be constructed to support the weight of soil, water, and mature trees. The hanging gardens were not a collection of potted plants on a balcony. They were described as containing massive specimens of cypress, cedar, date palm, and other large trees. A mature date palm, for instance, can weigh several tons when fully grown and saturated with water. A fully developed cedar tree might weigh even more. The structure supporting these trees had to be robust beyond what most modern readers might initially imagine. The construction of these terraces likely involved massive stone or brick supports, thick walls and pillars that could bear tremendous weight. These supports created hollow spaces or chambers beneath the planted areas. The root systems of the trees would have extended downward into soil that was piled onto the tops of these structures. Some scholars have proposed that the chambers beneath were built to allow for the circulation of air, preventing rot in the soil above. Others suggest that water flowing through channels above might have drained down through these chambers and out of the structure. The engineering would have had to be exquisitely balanced. The structure had to be strong enough to support the weight, yet porous or hollow enough to manage water and prevent waterlogging. The soil itself was a major logistical challenge. Babylon and Nineveh are situated in regions with soil that is generally poor for supporting diverse vegetation. To create a garden with hundreds of varieties of flowering plants, shrubs, and large trees required importing soil. The quantity needed would have been staggering. If the gardens covered, as some accounts suggest, an area of several acres, and if the depth of soil across the terraces averaged perhaps 10 or 15 feet, the volume of soil involved would be measured in hundreds of thousands of cubic yards. All of this soil had to be carried, probably by ox-drawn carts or baskets carried by hand, and placed onto the terraces. This is labour on an industrial scale, not a garden maintained by a few committed botanists, but a massive public works project requiring the resources of an empire. The soil would have been carefully selected or created through mixture. Rich dark soil from river floodplains would have been preferred, mixed with other materials to improve drainage and provide nutrients. The Mesopotamians were experienced farmers. They understood soil and its properties. They would have known which soils held moisture well, which drained too quickly, and which provided the nutrients that plants needed. Organic matter, composted material, animal manure, would have been added to enrich the soil. The resulting mixture would have been layered onto the terraces and compacted, creating a medium deep enough for the roots of large trees. Once the soil was in place and the irrigation system was operational, the challenge of maintaining the gardens became a perpetual engineering task. Water needed to be managed constantly. Too much water, particularly in an elevated garden where drainage was already problematic, would cause root rot. Too little water, in the heat of a Mesopotamian summer, would cause the plants to wither and die. The irrigation system would have required constant maintenance and adjustment. Channels would have clogged with sediment and algae. They would have needed to be cleaned regularly. Leaks in the lining would have developed over time. They would have needed to be sealed. The machinery, the screws, the shadeoffs, the wheels, would have required constant maintenance and occasional replacement. Consider the sheer human effort involved. Thousands of workers would have been required to operate the gardens at their peak. Some would have worked the water lifting machinery, operating shadoffs or cracking screws, from early morning until evening. Others would have been gardeners in the traditional sense, pruning trees, watering plants by hand where necessary, removing dead leaves and branches and managing pests. Still others would have been maintenance workers, repairing the irrigation system, replacing broken pipes and channels, sealing leaks, and shoring up damaged sections of the terraces. There would have been administrators and overseers, keeping records and organising the vast labour force. The gardens would have been a city within the city, a self-contained world of intense human activity, all devoted to maintaining this singular wonder. The construction alone, in its initial phase, would have taken decades. Moving and placing the millions of bricks or carved stones that form the terraces would have been a project lasting years. Building the irrigation system, with its miles of channels and aqueducts, would have required additional years. Transporting the hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of soil would have happened over seasons. Planting the thousands of trees and shrubs, selecting for viability, and arranging them aesthetically would have been a process of years as well. By the time the gardens were fully mature, with the trees grown large, the plants established, the entire system functioning in harmony, centuries might have passed since the first stone was laid. Some scholars, impressed by the engineering challenges, have questioned whether the gardens could have existed at all. How could a system so complex, requiring such constant maintenance, have been sustained? The answer lies in the resources of an empire. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, Nineveh under Sennacherib. These were among the greatest powers of their era. The resources devoted to a monument, to a garden that would serve as a symbol of the king's power and vision, would have been virtually unlimited. The labour force was available through conscription or slavery. The materials could be quarried or constructed. The knowledge and expertise accumulated over centuries of Mesopotamian engineering and agriculture could be brought to bear. The comparison to modern technology is illuminating. 20th and 21st century engineers have had to solve similar problems: how to grow plants in urban environments where soil is scarce, how to irrigate in arid climates, how to prevent waterlogging in elevated gardens. The solutions developed in recent decades, the green roofs with their complex drainage systems, the vertical gardens with their irrigation networks, the hydroponic systems that control water and nutrients with precision, these are not dramatically different in principle from what the ancients devised. The ancient engineers had no pumps powered by electricity, no plastic pipes, no programmable irrigation controllers. But they understood the fundamental principles. Water must be moved against gravity using leverage and mechanical advantage. Water must be distributed evenly. Excess water must be drained. Plants require appropriate soil and moisture. They solved these problems with materials and labour and ingenuity. The fact that modern technology can accomplish these tasks more easily and with greater precision speaks more to our advantages than to any deficiency in ancient understanding. Imagine yourself standing in the gardens during their height, feeling the cool spray of water falling from the channel above, hearing the constant gentle splash and trickle of irrigation. The air would have been heavy with moisture, almost tropical. The temperature, even in the height of summer, would have been noticeably cooler than the baking city outside the gardens, cooler than the bare desert beyond. The sound of water would have been constant, in channels and falling streams dripping from leaves and running in rivulets across the stone. The scent would have been extraordinary. Earth and water, the green smell of the living plants, the sweetness of flowers in bloom. Above your head, the canopy of mature trees would have created shade so complete that you would have felt you were standing in a different climate altogether. The light, filtered through the leaves, would have created dappled patterns on the pale stone of the terraces. The beauty would have been almost overwhelming, precisely engineered at every level, yet appearing to be entirely natural, a triumph of art over the arid landscape. The great gardens of Babylon, whether they stood in Babylon itself or in the more distant city of Nineveh, were not destined to last forever. The ancient world was one of constant upheaval, of empires rising and falling like the tides, and the most magnificent creations of humanity were often powerless against the forces of time and war. Understanding what happened to these gardens requires us to follow the threads of two different cities, two different fates, and ultimately, two different destructions that would erase these wonders from the living world, though never quite from human memory. Let us begin with the possibility that haunts many researchers most profoundly, that the Hanging Gardens stood not in Babylon itself, but in Nineveh, the magnificent capital of the Assyrian Empire. Nineveh was a city of breathtaking ambition, a place where King Sennacherib had lavished his considerable resources on creating something that transcended mere architecture, and became instead a statement about the power of his will and the reach of his vision. If the gardens were indeed his creation, standing in the shadow of his palaces and reflecting in the waters of the Kosa River, then their destruction came swiftly and catastrophically in the year 612 BCE. This was not a gradual decline or a slow erosion of a place by time. Rather, it was annihilation, sudden and nearly complete, visited upon Nineveh by a coalition of armies led by the Babylonians and the Medes, peoples who had grown weary of Assyrian dominance and saw their chance to strike at the heart of that empire. The assault on Nineveh was one of the most devastating military campaigns of the ancient world, and the city, which had seemed so permanent, so inevitable in its grandeur, was essentially erased from the map in a matter of months. The destruction was comprehensive and methodical. The great walls that had protected the city for centuries were breached, and once that barrier fell, nothing could stop the invading armies from penetrating deep into Nineveh's heart. The palaces where kings had ruled were set aflame. The libraries where scholars had preserved centuries of human knowledge were scattered and buried under rubble. And if the Hanging Gardens had existed in this place, they too would have been consumed by this conflagration. One can imagine the careful irrigation systems, the aqueducts and channels that had been engineered with such precision, being destroyed in moments. The machines that had lifted water up to those impossible heights would have been torn apart. The plants themselves, those exotic specimens that had been gathered from across the known world, would have withered and burned. The garden that Sennacherib had created as a monument to his own magnificence would have become simply another casualty of war, another wonder returned to dust. The destruction was so absolute that for many centuries afterward, Nineveh ceased to exist as a living city. It became a heap of ruins, lost beneath accumulating soil and sand, unknown and unvisited except by nomadic peoples who passed through the region. Yet there exists another possibility, one that many historians have considered at length. Perhaps the gardens stood in Babylon itself, and if so, their fate followed a different trajectory. Babylon did not fall to military conquest and immediate destruction as Nineveh had. Instead, the city experienced a long, gradual decline that extended across several centuries. When Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he did not destroy the city. Rather, the Persians incorporated Babylon into their vast empire, treating it as one of their great administrative centers. For some time, the city continued to function, to maintain its position of importance, though it was no longer the independent power it had once been. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed here, would have continued to be maintained, would have continued to serve as a place of beauty and respite for those who held power in the city. We might imagine that successive rulers, Persian governors and later Hellenistic kings, would have seen value in preserving such a creation, just as later civilizations often maintain and cherish the great works of their predecessors. The real decline of Babylon came more slowly, a gradual fading rather than a sudden catastrophe. Over the course of generations, the center of power shifted away from Babylon. The Seleucid kings, who ruled the region after Alexander the Great's death, built new cities and concentrated their resources elsewhere. Babylon, once the jewel of the ancient world, became increasingly peripheral to the concerns of those who held power. Its population dwindled as people moved away seeking opportunities in newer, more vibrant cities. The Great Walls began to crumble not because of warfare, but because there were no longer enough people living there to maintain them properly. The temples fell into disrepair. The markets that had once thrived with merchants and traders grew quiet. And gradually, the irrigation systems that had sustained the gardens began to fail. Without constant maintenance and the resources to repair them, the aqueducts would have developed leaks. The channels would have become clogged with silt. The delicate balance that had been maintained between the gardens and the river would have been lost. Alexander the Great himself visited Babylon, arriving there in 331 BCE after defeating the Persian forces at the Battle of Gaugamela. The ancient sources tell us that he found the city still impressive, still magnificent, still a place of grandeur and beauty. He chose to make Babylon his capital, seeing in it something worth preserving. Yet Alexander died in Babylon just 8 years later, in 323 BCE, and the great work of maintaining and ruling his empire fell into the hands of his quarrelling generals. Babylon declined further after his death, as his successors fought among themselves and the empire was divided. If the Hanging Gardens stood in Babylon, they would have been maintained during Alexander's time, but after his death they would have experienced the same slow abandonment and deterioration that affected the rest of the city. By the Parthian period, when Rome had become the dominant power in the Western world, Babylon had become little more than a provincial settlement, a shadow of what it had once been. Whether the gardens fell in the catastrophic destruction of Nineveh or the slow decline of Babylon, their physical existence as a living, functional place came to an end. Yet it is one of the most remarkable aspects of human culture that the memory of something can persist far longer than the thing itself. The Hanging Gardens did not die when the gardens themselves were destroyed or abandoned. Instead, they were transformed into something different. A story, a legend, an idea that passed from person to person across the centuries, changing slightly in the telling, becoming more magical and more mysterious with each retelling, until they had become the greatest wonder that the ancient world could imagine. The mechanism by which this memory survived is worth examining in some detail, for it reveals much about how human knowledge was preserved in the ancient world. The Greeks and Romans who lived after the destruction of Babylon had access to accounts written by travellers and merchants who had actually seen the city in its glory. Strabo, the great Greek geographer, was writing in the 1st century BCE, more than 200 years after Alexander's death, and yet he had access to descriptions of Babylon that had been preserved in earlier sources. These accounts, which had been passed down through libraries and among scholars, contained references to the magnificent gardens. When later writers like Diodorus Siculus compiled histories of the ancient world, they drew upon these earlier sources, sometimes quoting them directly, sometimes paraphrasing what they had read. Yet here is where the story becomes complex, for none of these ancient writers had actually seen the Hanging Gardens with their own eyes. They were writing from accounts written by others, and those accounts may have themselves been based on reports that had been modified or embellished in the retelling. Some scholars have noted that certain ancient descriptions of the gardens are remarkably similar to descriptions of other royal gardens that certainly did exist, such as the gardens of Pasargadae, which were built by Cyrus the Great in Persia. The romantic persistence of the image of the Hanging Gardens is something that deserves our contemplation as we move deeper into sleep, and our minds become more receptive to the power of imagination. Human beings have always had a desire to create paradise, to build for themselves a little piece of heaven on earth, and the image of gardens hanging impossibly in the air, verdant and beautiful, defying the desert heat and the barrenness that surrounded them, spoke to something deep in the human soul. These gardens represented the triumph of human ingenuity and effort over nature's indifference. They represented beauty created in the midst of harshness, fertility achieved in the face of aridity. Is it any wonder that such an image would capture the imagination of people across the centuries, that it would be repeated and elaborated upon, that it would eventually become the greatest wonder of the ancient world in the minds of those who had never seen it? Consider for a moment the other great gardens that existed in the ancient world, for humanity's eternal desire to create paradise on earth found expression in many places and in many forms. In Persia, Cyrus the Great had created the gardens of Pasargadae, and these gardens were real, substantial places that can still be identified and studied by archaeologists today. They were laid out in the formal Persian style, with water channels dividing the space into 4 sections, each section containing pools and plantings arranged in careful geometric patterns. These gardens reflected the Persian vision of what paradise should look like: orderly, harmonious, a perfect balance between human design and natural beauty. In Rome, the emperors built gardens within the city itself, spaces like the gardens of Caesar and the gardens of Pompey, where the wealthy could retreat from the noise and chaos of urban life and find themselves surrounded by beauty and tranquility. Chinese imperial gardens, meanwhile, were constructed according to entirely different aesthetic principles, emphasizing the appearance of natural landscape and the careful balance between emptiness and fullness, between built structures and open space. In all these cases, gardens served the same fundamental purpose. They were spaces created by those with power and resources to demonstrate their wealth and their refinement, but also to provide themselves and their guests with respite from the demands of rule and the troubles of the world. The Hanging Gardens, whether they existed or not, whether they stood in Babylon or Nineveh or nowhere at all, fit perfectly into this tradition of royal gardens. The image of them embodied all the qualities that made gardens appealing: the mastery of nature, the creation of beauty in improbable places, the recreation of paradise through human effort and ingenuity. The fact that they were said to hang in the air made them all the more magical, all the more impressive. A garden at ground level, no matter how beautiful, was simply a garden, but a garden suspended high above the ground, one that seemed to defy gravity and the laws of nature, was something far more. It was a wonder, a marvel, something that spoke of powers and abilities that transcended the merely mortal. This quality may be one of the reasons why the memory of the Hanging Gardens proved so persistent, so powerful, so capable of surviving across 26 centuries of human history. In our own time, we possess technologies that earlier generations could not have imagined. Tools that allow us to see beneath the surface of the earth without excavating it. Devices that can analyze soil composition and detect buried structures. Satellites that can image ancient sites with remarkable precision. Archaeological teams working in Iraq in recent decades have brought these tools to bear on the question of the Hanging Gardens, searching for definitive evidence of their existence and their location. Ground-penetrating radar has been used to scan the soil beneath both Babylon and Nineveh, looking for the kinds of geological signatures that would indicate the presence of extensive irrigation systems. Satellite imaging has revealed ancient patterns in the landscape, changes in the way the earth has been modified by human activity that might point to the location of the gardens. Archaeologists have examined the ancient texts with the tools of textual analysis, comparing different accounts and trying to identify which details are likely to be historically accurate and which are probably embellishments or errors. Research teams have studied the geology of both Babylon and Nineveh, trying to determine whether the water supplies would have been adequate to support the gardens as they have been described, and whether the engineering knowledge available at the time would have been sufficient to construct such systems. Yet despite all of these modern tools and techniques, we still do not have definitive proof of the existence of the Hanging Gardens, and we still cannot say with certainty where they stood or even whether they stood anywhere at all. This uncertainty is humbling in its way. It suggests that there are still mysteries in the world, questions that we have not yet answered, secrets that the ancient world still keeps from us even in our age of advanced technology and scientific knowledge. The search continues, and archaeological work proceeds in Iraq, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East, where such sites might be found. Each season brings new techniques, new questions, and new hopes that perhaps this will be the year that we finally discover the answer to one of history's greatest riddles. Yet it is important to acknowledge that this search for the truth about the Hanging Gardens has not been easy, and it has not been pursued in a vacuum. The lands where ancient Babylon and Nineveh once stood have been the scene of terrible conflicts in the modern world, conflicts that have caused immense suffering and have damaged many of the archaeological treasures that these regions contain. Iraq has been the site of wars, revolutions, and internal conflict throughout much of the modern era, but particularly in recent decades. During the wars of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, archaeological sites were damaged, looted, and in some cases destroyed. The great museums of Iraq, which contained irreplaceable artifacts from Babylonian and Assyrian times, were broken into and ransacked. Archaeological digs were halted as the security situation made it impossible to work safely. Nineveh, that great city in northern Iraq, suffered particular damage. The site was occupied by armed groups, and structures were demolished. In 2016 and 2017, ISIS militants deliberately destroyed massive ancient sculptures at Nineveh, attacking cultural heritage as part of their campaign of terror. Babylon too has not been spared the effects of modern conflict. The site has been damaged by military activity, and the instability in the region has made it difficult for archaeologists to work there safely and to pursue the kind of sustained, long-term excavations that would be necessary to answer definitively the questions about the gardens. This damage to archaeological sites caused by modern warfare is something that deserves our contemplation and our sorrow. Every time an ancient structure is destroyed, every time a museum is looted, every time a site is damaged by military activity, we lose not just physical objects, but also connections to our past, pieces of the story of human civilization that can never be recovered. The Hanging Gardens, whether they existed in Babylon or Nineveh or elsewhere, are ultimately part of the shared heritage of humanity, not the possession of any one nation or people. When these sites are damaged, all of humanity is diminished. The knowledge they might contain, the secrets they might reveal, the understanding of ancient engineering and aesthetics, and the human desire for beauty that they might provide, all of these are lost forever when sites are damaged or destroyed. Yet even in the face of this loss and this uncertainty, the Hanging Gardens endure in human imagination and memory. They exist not as ruins buried in the Iraqi countryside, not as descriptions in ancient texts, but as an idea, a symbol, a representation of the human desire to create beauty and to transcend the limitations of nature. They represent something that every person who has ever sought to create something beautiful can understand. The impulse to make something wonderful, something that has no practical purpose beyond the pleasure and the wonder it brings to those who experience it. This is a uniquely human quality, this desire to create beauty for its own sake, and the Hanging Gardens, in their mystery and their magnificence, are one of the greatest expressions of that impulse that we have inherited from the ancient world. As we continue our journey through the story of these gardens, toward the deeper states of relaxation and sleep that we seek, let us take comfort in the knowledge that even when physical things are destroyed, even when cities fall and empires crumble, even when time itself works to erase the monuments of the past, the memory of beauty and wonder can persist. The gardens may no longer exist in the form that Sennacherib or Nebuchadnezzar created them, but they exist in the stories we tell about them, in the fascination they continue to inspire, in the questions they prompt us to ask about the capabilities of ancient peoples and the power of human imagination. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, I'd love it if you shared this video with someone who might need it tonight. And hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Now, where were we? The Hanging Gardens endure in memory because they speak to something eternal in human nature, something that transcends time and geography, something that connects us to people who lived thousands of years ago and felt the same desires that we feel today. The desire to create, to build, to make something beautiful in a world that is often harsh and indifferent to our efforts. In the end, whether the gardens stood in Babylon or Nineveh, whether they were as grand as the ancient descriptions suggest or more modest in their actual appearance, whether they existed at all or were entirely a creation of human imagination, they have achieved a kind of immortality that their creators could never have imagined. They have become a legend, a mystery, a wonder that continues to captivate us across the vast gulf of centuries, and perhaps that is the greatest achievement of all. Not that the gardens were built, but that the memory of their beauty has been preserved and passed forward through time, inspiring us still to imagine what might have been, to wonder at the capabilities of those who came before us, and to recognize in the Hanging Gardens something that speaks to the deepest part of our humanity. In the vast stretching silence of history, where empires crumble into dust and cities dissolve into legend, there remains one garden that has never truly faded. It lives not in stone or soil, but in the human imagination, a place of such perfect beauty that it became more real through its mystery than it ever could have been in simple fact. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon exist most vividly in the moments just before sleep, when the mind releases its grip on certainty and allows itself to wander into the realm of possibility, into spaces where longing and creation meet in perfect harmony. To understand what the Hanging Gardens mean is to understand something fundamental about what it means to be human. For throughout our entire existence, across every continent and every age, we have shared a single, unshakable impulse, the need to create beauty. Not because beauty ensures survival, not because it provides shelter or food, but because something within us insists on it. Something whispers that life is worth beautifying, that the world deserves colour and fragrance and grace, even, perhaps especially in places where harshness dominates. The Hanging Gardens, whether they existed in Babylon or Nineveh, whether they were built by Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib, represent the triumph of this impulse. They are in essence humanity's love letter to beauty itself, and perhaps more than that, they are a love letter from one person to another. The stories surrounding the gardens, however historically uncertain they may be, return again and again to love as their motivation. Nebuchadnezzar building towers of green for his wife Amytis, a princess from the mountains who missed the verdant hills of her homeland as she walked through endless dusty streets. The image is so deeply human, so perfectly touching. A king commanding the very earth to transform itself so that his beloved might feel less homesick, less lonely, less lost. It speaks to something that transcends history or geography. It speaks to the willingness we all have, or wish we had, to reshape the world for those we love, to say, I see your sorrow, I will build you something beautiful, I will make you a garden. In the story of Sennacherib and his palace without rival, we find a different but equally powerful love. The Assyrian king building his garden paradise perhaps loved beauty itself more than any person. His love was for the ideal, for the perfect expression of human capability and vision. He wanted to stand in the midst of his creation and think, this is what human hands can do. This is what human minds can conceive and build. This is our gift to the world. There is loneliness in this kind of love, and also tremendous dignity. It is the love an artist pours into a work they may never see fully appreciated, the love a creator gives to something they craft knowing it might not survive them. Both stories teach the same essential truth. We build gardens because we love. We build them for people we cherish, for beauty itself, for the future, for the simple fact that something in us cannot rest until we have made the world a little more like paradise. And in doing this, in responding to this deep creative impulse, we become most fully ourselves. We transcend our own limitations. We transform stone and earth and labour into something that sings. Throughout human civilization, in cultures separated by continents and centuries, gardens have held a sacred place. They are not merely practical spaces for growing food, though they are certainly that. They are repositories of meaning, vessels for our deepest longings. In the ancient texts of many faiths, paradise itself is imagined as a garden. The Garden of Eden, that perfect beginning place of all human story, exists in the collective memory of Western civilization as a space of abundance, innocence, and divine connection. It was a garden that humanity lost, and the loss of it, the expulsion from it, defines everything that comes after. We are beings who dream of returning to gardens, who spend our lives trying to recreate in small and large ways that sense of peace and wholeness that a perfect garden represents. In Islamic tradition, the vision of paradise is not a distant abstract heaven, but Jannah, a garden of extraordinary beauty and comfort. Streams flow through it, shade trees offer respite, every flower blooms in eternal season, and those within it experience perfect peace. The paradise that believers hope for is specifically, unmistakably a garden. This is not coincidental. The tradition recognizes that for human hearts, a garden is the most perfect expression of heaven that we can imagine. It combines shelter with openness, the presence of life with the gift of rest, the beauty of nature with the comfort of intention and care. A garden says, you are safe here, you can rest here, here all is well. In Japan, the tradition of Zen gardening creates spaces of profound meditation and peace. A few stones, carefully placed, raked sand suggesting water, a single tree. The minimal design paradoxically creates a sense of infinite possibility and calm. The gardener is not trying to display nature's abundance, but to capture its essence, the way a single brushstroke in ink painting can contain the entire spirit of a mountain. These gardens teach that paradise does not require overwhelming abundance. It requires intention, meaning, arrangement. It requires someone who has thought carefully about what brings peace and has shaped a space to deliver it. In English tradition, the cottage garden grew up around the homes of ordinary people, not nobility. These gardens bloomed with practical plants, herbs for healing, vegetables for eating, but they also offered something else. They offered the cottagers a small space they could call their own, could tend with their own hands, could watch transform across the seasons. In these gardens, people poor in material wealth created abundance. They created colour, fragrance, life. They created a small pocket of beauty that belonged to them, that they could shape and nurture. The cottage garden is democracy in botanical form, the insistence that beauty is not the exclusive property of kings and emperors, but belongs to everyone. All of these traditions, the Islamic Jannah, the Zen garden, the English cottage garden, the lost paradise of Eden, point to a single truth that seems to be wired into human consciousness. Peace is a garden. Safety is a garden. Rest is a garden. When we imagine perfect comfort, when we dream of places where our weary hearts might find respite, we imagine gardens. We imagine green things, growing things. We imagine shade and water, the sound of leaves, the scent of flowers, the knowledge that somewhere something is alive and thriving and beautiful. The hanging gardens of Babylon in this context become a kind of cosmic symbol. They are the garden that all human beings are always searching for. They are the earthly paradise we glimpse in dreams and remember in our deepest being. That they may never have existed in the way they were described, that they may be a beautiful confusion, a merging of memories and places, does not diminish their power. If anything, it deepens it. Because the hanging gardens, in not being fixed to a single location or verified historical fact, belong to all of us. They are the garden in the mind. They are the eternal garden that every human heart seeks. The search for the hanging gardens across centuries, across thousands of miles of desert and scholarship, is itself a kind of garden. It is a garden of the human spirit, the impulse to seek, to wonder, to imagine that such beauty might exist. The scholars following dusty trails, the archaeologists sifting through ancient texts, the dreamers lying awake imagining what they might have looked like. All of these people are walking through the gardens. They are tending them with their curiosity and their hope. The gardens exist most vividly in the places where people seek them, where people refuse to let them be forgotten, where people insist that even if they are lost to the physical world, they can never be lost to human memory and imagination. There is something profoundly healing in this. The recognition that what we seek can exist even in uncertainty. What we dream of can live even without physical form. The Hanging Gardens have outlasted every stone. They have survived the fall of empires, the death of dynasties, the transformation of geography. No hurricane could destroy them. No earthquake could crack them. No invader could burn them. They exist beyond the reach of time and destruction because they exist in the human heart. And that is a safer place than any garden made of stone could ever be. But let us imagine for a moment what it would have been like to walk through them. Close your eyes and imagine it. You are in the heart of Babylon or Nineveh, cities of baked brick and heat, surrounded by desert that stretches endlessly in every direction. The sun beats down without mercy. The earth beneath your feet is hard and dry. And then you step beneath an archway, beneath a canopy of leaves, and everything changes. The air grows cool. The light becomes soft and green. Your ears, which have been hearing only the sounds of wind and distant voices, now hear the gentle murmur of water. A fountain, perhaps, or a series of cascades, water moving downward in defiance of the surrounding aridity. You can hear it like a whisper, like a voice welcoming you home. The fragrance reaches you next. It is not the harsh smell of sand and dust, but the tender scent of flowers. Perhaps roses, those flowers most prized in the ancient world for their fragrance and their beauty. Perhaps jasmine, filling the evening air with perfume. Perhaps the green smell of growing things, the particular freshness that comes from soil that is watered and tended. Your senses, accustomed to the desert, begin to relax. They recognize this place. They know what it means to be in a garden. Around you, plants rise in tiers and cascades. Trees provide a canopy of shade. Their leaves move slightly in a breeze that feels like a caress after the relentless desert heat. Beneath them, flowering plants bloom in colours that seem too vivid for reality. Deep reds, pure whites, yellows like captured sunlight. The greens are every shade imaginable, from the silvery green of olive leaves to the rich emerald of full-leafed vines. Paths wind through the garden, encouraging you to walk, to explore, to move deeper into this sanctuary. The water is everywhere, a constant presence and comfort. It falls from level to level, transported up through mechanisms both mechanical and clever. The ancient engineers who built this place understood that in the desert, water is life, and so they made water a celebration. They made it visible and audible and present. You could stand in the garden and hear the sound of water from every direction, knowing that in this place you need never be thirsty. In this place, the thing that is most precious in the world has been brought to abundance. There is coolness here. Real coolness, not the temporary relief of moving into shade, but an actual lowering of temperature created by the water, by the shade, by the very fact of all these plants breathing and creating a different microclimate than the desert beyond. You can feel it on your skin. You can sense your body beginning to relax, your shoulders dropping from where they have been tensed against the heat. You are beginning to feel safe. You are beginning to feel at rest. In this place, a person from the mountains missing the green valleys of their home might find solace. They might walk beneath the trees and remember rain. They might breathe the fragrance of flowers and remember meadows. They might hear water and remember streams running through their childhood landscape. The garden would be a bridge across loss, a way of making the unbridgeable desert feel less lonely. It would say, "I know you are far from home. I've brought your home to you." And a ruler creating such a place, looking at it and knowing that it sprang from their vision, that it exists because they commanded it into being, that thousands of hands have worked to make it real, that ruler would feel something almost like divinity. The power to make the barren bloom, the power to create beauty where nature offered only harshness, the power to make a desert into a paradise. It is the closest a human being can come to godlike creation, to reshape the world according to a vision of beauty and peace. What remains most powerfully true about the Hanging Gardens is this: they are gone. The stones have been reclaimed by desert or buried by time. The gardens themselves have vanished. The gardens that may never have existed in the way they were described have definitively ceased to exist. And yet they have never been forgotten. They remain in every list of wonders. They remain in every child's imagination of paradise. They remain in our minds as a monument to human longing and human capability. This teaches us something essential about what we build and what survives. The structures that last are not always the ones we think will endure. The monuments that matter most are often the ones that exist primarily in memory and imagination. The Great Pyramid of Giza still stands, but the Hanging Gardens have perhaps a greater presence in human consciousness because they are lost to us. They exist in the space between memory and wonder, between historical fact and human longing. They are a mirror in which we see reflected our own deepest desires, our desire to create, to love, to make beauty bloom in harsh places, to leave something behind that matters. And there is comfort in this, if we allow ourselves to feel it. If we accept that what matters most about human creation is not whether it physically endures, because nothing does, eventually. Everything returns to dust. The mightiest empire crumbles. The most solid stone eventually weathers to sand. What matters is the impulse that created it, the love that motivated it, the vision that inspired it, the care that was poured into it. These things do not crumble. These things are not lost. They echo forward through time, shaping how humans think about beauty and gardens, and the possibilities of creating paradise. In moments like this, as you lie still and listen to these words, you may find that you are experiencing a kind of garden yourself. This space, this moment, this darkness into which you have allowed yourself to fall, it is a garden of sorts. It is a place you have created by choosing to rest. It is a place where the world's harshness is kept at a distance. It is a place of safety and comfort, tended by the simple act of your own attention and intention. You have made a garden of your night. You have created a space where your tired mind and body can find peace. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, whether they existed in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon or Sennacherib's Nineveh, whether they were the creation of a king's love or a king's ambition, whether they were built to ease a wife's homesickness or to demonstrate an empire's power, they exist now most fully in this space that you occupy. They exist in the garden of rest you are creating with every breath, with every moment you allow yourself to sink deeper into the comfort of stillness. The gardens are not gone, they are here. They are the cool shade you imagine when the world feels too hot. They are the water you hear in the rustling of leaves. They are the beauty you remember in your deepest heart when you close your eyes and let yourself imagine paradise. As your eyes grow heavier and your mind moves more slowly through these words, as the space between waking and sleeping grows larger and softer, know this. You are walking through a garden. The Hanging Gardens have found you. They live in the peace that is descending upon you now, in the safety of your own resting place, in the certainty that for this moment you are protected and at ease. The ancient world made gardens for the people they loved. Now, in this moment, you have made a garden for yourself. You have chosen peace. You have chosen rest. You have chosen to lie in stillness and let your mind wander through the flowering paths of memory and imagination. And in doing so, you have ensured that the gardens will never truly be lost. As long as there is someone seeking them, someone dreaming of them, someone finding solace and peace in the idea of them, the Hanging Gardens will exist. They will bloom eternal in the gardens of human consciousness. They will shimmer in the memories of all who have loved beauty and all who have sought rest. They will remain, as true and as real as anything that has ever existed, in the hearts of all who have paused to imagine them, all who have wondered about them, all who have recognized in them the deepest human need, the need for beauty, for peace, for the assurance that somewhere, somehow, paradise can be found. Thank you for spending your evening with the Calm Archive. If this helped you relax tonight, subscribe so you never miss a new video. I upload every day, and there's always something new to drift off to. Tell me in the comments, if you could visit any ancient wonder, which one would it be? As you continue deeper into sleep, carry with you the image of those gardens. Carry the coolness of their shade. Carry the sound of their waters. Carry the fragrance of their flowers. The Hanging Gardens exist wherever peace is found, wherever beauty is loved, wherever someone chooses to rest. They are yours to explore in your dreams. Rest well, the gardens are waiting. Ah,